everyone, this is Lair, and I asked you guys to give me some questions on Discord. I talked to my sponsors first, and then I talked to everybody else in the Discord server, and I said, what kind of questions would you want answered in a Q&A style video? So the very first question that I got was from Lair Gamer. He said, what game do you think pushed the Super Nintendo hardware to its limit? I think that's probably been answered a lot of times. I think it's probably like one of those FX chip games, you know, like a Star Fox or Stunt Race FX, which ran notoriously awfully on the Super Nintendo, or maybe a game with really good Mode 7 stuff like Demon's Crest or something like that. I'm sure a ton of people have answered that question. So I took it a different way, and I'm kind of cheating already on the very first video. But I'm going to show you instead this game called Emote Volume 1. Emote is it's like a visual novel kind of, and it's very unique because Emote has a really cool little peripheral in here called the Voicer Coon, and we're going to check that out in just a second. But this game was made in order to teach Japanese native speakers how to speak English, and it's kind of a learning aid. So it takes you through this story, and as you're going through the story, you have a CD that you're listening to English and Japanese translations on, and it's supposed to give you an idea of how to translate what's happening in the story. But anyway, I'm going to pull out that peripheral, and I'll show you in just a second. First thing that I mentioned, the Voicer Coon peripheral. We'll come back to that in a minute, but you can see it's got a Super Nintendo controller port, and then it's just got this weird little box, and we'll talk about what this box is for in just a second. Next, we have, of course, the game cartridge, which is a Super Famicom cartridge, so it looks like this. If you're in the PAL region, you probably recognize that, but in America, you know, a normal Super Nintendo game looks something like this instead. But you can play them all on the same system, so you can play Super Famicom games on a Super Nintendo if you break this little tab that's in there. One extra thing that I'll mention about the playing Super Famicom games on a Super Nintendo is that it's a great option if you're just getting into game collecting and you want to collect Super Nintendo games, because there are a lot of Super Nintendo games that you can get way cheaper if you buy the Super Famicom cartridges rather than the Super Nintendo versions. So in order to convert your Super Nintendo to play Super Famicom games, there's just these two little tabs when you open it up, and that's what these little notches fit into. These notches on a Super Nintendo cartridge fit into those little tabs in your Super Nintendo. And if you take some pliers, needle nose pliers, and tear those little tabs out, then all of a sudden you can fit these Super Famicom cartridges in there that don't have those little divots. That said, if you're just getting into collecting and you like Mario games and things like that, you can collect the Mario games super cheap. I bought, I think, every Super Nintendo Mario game in a lot on eBay, and I think I probably paid $60 for the whole set, and they are way, way more expensive if you buy the Super Nintendo versions instead. All right, so back to actually answering the question. Talking about Emote, you get the game cartridge, of course. You get this cool booklet, which is a very thick, substantial instruction booklet, of course, mostly in Japanese. There are some little illustrations with some Romanized text that you can flip through, but other than that, it's just a very high quality book, 'cause it's all colored and you know, it's pretty neat, although, like I said, most of it you can't read because it's in very thick, dense Japanese. Then the final things that we get in this package are these two discs, and these are the crux. This is the meat and potatoes of the whole thing, is these two discs right here. And these are soundtrack discs, and you put these soundtrack discs inside of a CD player or whatever, and you put it up on your shelf on the other side of the room. Now here's the really, really cool part about this whole setup, and the reason why I chose to bring this game up when Lair asked me what game pushed the Super Nintendo to its limits, because I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, how does that push the Super Nintendo to its limits? It doesn't really, but I think it's cool and I wanted to share it. So remember earlier I showed you this little thing, the Voicer Coon. It's got the little controller dongle on it. So we can plug this into our Super Nintendo and set it up on our entertainment center or whatever, set it right in front of the TV like that. And this little black piece right here is an IR transmitter. And this is going to be able to send signals to your CD player that you've set up on the other side of the room. And it's really simple because it only needs to do a few things. It needs to be able to pause and play, and it needs to be able to skip forward and skip backwards. So then you have your little CD soundtrack that you've got in your CD player on the other side of the room, sitting up on a shelf or whatever. And this IR transmitter is sending signals to the CD player in order to flip through all the tracks on this CD. So as you're playing the game on the TV, because the Super Nintendo was unable to produce such high quality and natural sounding voices, they created this solution so that you could put the CD in your CD player, and while you were playing the game on your Super Famicom, this little device right here would be skipping through the tracks on this disc. And in doing so, it gives you the background audio for what's happening on the TV. So the game, when you have it put in your Super Famicom, all you're hearing through your TV is the music. And then these CDs have all the dialogue on them. And I think it's so cool that they came up with this idea, convoluted as it is, to give you this little voicer-coon thing to switch around your tracks on your CD player so that you can use real high-quality audio. I think it's so cool. I only have volume 1 of this. Someday I'm going to get volume 2 and 3. I think there's just 3 total. But this game also came out on some other systems. It came out on the PlayStation, I think. Maybe it came out on the 3DO. I think it came out on Windows. I don't know what else, but I think that the Super Famicom version is the most impressive because of this cool little piece of technology right here. I think that this thing is so neat. All right, so question number 2 came from my friend Tony, Controller Hog. Some of you might know he's a streamer and a content creator on YouTube. He asked, at what point do you consider something to be retro? And that is a really tough question to answer because sometimes people get mad at you when you say that something too new is retro because they're like, wait a second, I'm really old and that offends me. And that's basically the crux of it. I mean, it depends, you know, because if you're if you're 15, you know, the scope of what you think is retro is probably going to make some older people a little bit uncomfortable. And I get it because I'm a little bit older now. And sometimes when I hear people talking about the games of their youth, I feel hurt a little bit. Not offended, just hurt. That said, I want to tiptoe really carefully so as not to offend anyone. I consider, personally, don't take any offense to this. Please, promise me. Before I say anything, promise me you're not going to take any offense to it. Stop typing in the comments. You're already doing it. Stop. I consider, if I say to my wife, I'm going out and I'm going to look for some retro games, what I mean by that is that I'm going out to look for anything before PS3, Wii, and Xbox 360. That's what I mean when I say that. And I know almost no one would consider those retro. I get it. I understand. But that's what I personally say if I'm going to look for retro games. I'm looking for PS3, Xbox 360, or Wii games. And that's okay, right? I think it is. Now, the Wii especially, I think I can make a compelling case for the Wii, okay? You're thinking PS3 and 360, those are HD systems, and they were created in 2006 or whatever, and they are not retro systems. And I get it. I understand where you're coming from. But the Wii, get this, the Wii is a retro system. I stand by this. It's revolutionary technology with the motion controls and the Wiimote and everything. But the best way to play the Wii, I'm telling you, the best way to play the Wii is to hook it up to a CRT TV, an old school TV, and make sure that you're playing in 4:3 and not 16:9. Because the Wii does support 16:9, but it's a stretched 16:9. So here's what that means. A lot of games that were made in that time period, you know, 2006 to let's say 2012 maybe, a lot of the games that were made in that time period were made in native widescreen. So that means that all the texturing, all of the basically the way that the camera was aspected was in widescreen. So you'd see a large image. However, Nintendo didn't really do that. They kind of skimped a little bit, and what they did is they made a lot of games in regular old full screen 4:3, and then they stretched them out to 16:9. So when you play Wii games, a lot of them, maybe they look totally normal because you've always played them in 16:9, but the majority of them, a large majority, were actually formatted to 4:3 by default. Hey guys, it's your buddy Editing Lair, and I could tell already that some people were probably going to say, but Lair, weren't the games made such that when they were stretched, they would look correct? Yes, that's true, they were made that way, but I still think that pretty much every Wii game looks better in 4:3. So, I say all of that just to say that if you play your Wii games on a CRT TV, it will eliminate some of those jagged edges that come from the system not being an HD console. I mean, it really is a sub-HD 480p sort of thing. It'll eliminate a lot of the jagged edges. It makes the image a lot smoother. And then you also have the added benefit of being able to play in 4:3, which you can do on a widescreen TV too. And it'll make your picture look better in most games, I promise. Try it. Try Mario Galaxy out. Go load up Mario Galaxy 1 or 2, either one, and change your Wii system settings to scrunch it down to 4:3 and just see what it looks like. I guarantee it looks really cool. Maybe you don't care about that. I do. I think it's awesome, but maybe you don't. I mean, I think composite video, I mean, sub HD video, I think that's pretty retro at this point. And I mean, we got to draw the line somewhere, right? I mean, retro's moving all the time, right? And even if we say 20 years old is the threshold, we're still talking GameCube, PS2, Xbox, you know? So I think it's okay to throw in the PS3, 360, Wii. I don't know, maybe that's just me, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm dumb. Tell me in the comments, or don't, please. So Tony asked me something else too in that same question. He said, do you consider systems and peripherals that came before consoles to be worthy collectibles? That's a tough question, because what does worthy collectible even mean, you know? I always kind of err on the side of we have to preserve this stuff because I think it's all so cool, and no one's making a new copy of Dinotopia on the Xbox. You know, is the first game I saw. Nobody's making a new copy of that. And actually, with that game, they probably shouldn't make another copy of it. But all of that to say that nobody's making another copy. It's history. And if you like video games, like most of the people watching this probably do, preserve that stuff. You know, don't throw away the old boxes and the manuals. If you're ever going to throw them away, send them to me. Don't throw that stuff away. That's one of the reasons why I dislike GameStop so much. And I know it's like cliche and everybody dislikes GameStop now. So it's like, oh yeah, no big deal, right? But the thing is, they throw away the old boxes and the manuals to these games. And I have to believe, I have to think that if they sell all of their used retro games in the same price for any condition, what's the point? What is the incentive for them to keep all those boxes and manuals? I don't think there is one. And I think there's actually a lot of incentive because of the big corporate thing and just sell the games, sell them all for the same price, whatever. I think there's a lot of incentive for them in that situation to throw away the boxes and manuals. Because, I mean, you look at this. So GameStop sells a game like Star Fox on the Super Nintendo for, I'm assuming, very little money, and they're gonna sell it. I think they probably sell this, I'm gonna just snowball, $7.99. Very cheap Super Nintendo game, maybe a little more now. Now, if they sell this game, regardless of what condition it is, for $7.99, it's gonna sell, they know it's gonna sell, and they have no incentive to keep this big, bulky box sitting around. They have no incentive at all. So this box versus this game, that's what we're talking about. GameStop has no incentive to keep this giant bulky box. And I never see GameStop selling people boxed Super Nintendo games. Now, in their defense, there are probably not too many people who are selling boxed Super Nintendo games or whatever to GameStop. Understandable, because they would only get like $1 for Star Fox probably. But there's no incentive there to preserve the history. None at all. And I understand that that's probably not important to GameStop, doesn't really need to be important to GameStop, but that's what I hate about the idea of a place like that, that has all these old retro games sitting in a warehouse and they're just reselling them to people, is that the history is totally lost. You know, we're throwing out all the cool stuff that you can't get again. The manual that's in here that there are only a limited number of copies of, thrown out. The box that, you know, who knows, say they had a box this pristine, you know, that looked so good and they just throw it away. Crazy, crazy. Now to Tony's actual question, which was, do you think it's worthwhile to collect those old systems before consoles like the NES, etc.? I do think it is. I really do. I think it's part of preserving that history, is keeping as much of that stuff intact as possible. There are things that I have that I think are just worth keeping because of the history, because of the kind of stepping stones that got us to where we are today. And I know that's silly, because I'm not a historian, I don't own a museum, I get it, it's stupid, but at the same time, it's not stupid, it's really smart, and I want to do it. And it's not, for me, about the value of the stuff necessarily. I really, that's kind of secondary to me. I really like to see history set in stone, everything's, you know, taken care of in a well-conditioned environment, and it's not just going to decay and fall apart any faster than it has to, because all this stuff's going to fall apart eventually anyway. That said, here's a cool thing that I just have in my collection that's not... This is a good example of what I mean when I say that it's kind of crazy, and I know it's crazy. This is a box for a Donkey Kong Jr. Game & Watch system. I don't own one of these. I don't have one, but I do have the box, and the box is in fantastic condition. Some guy brought this into a game store one time, and he wanted to see if they would give him anything for it, and they didn't, and then the game store gave it to me. So I have this box in my collection. I think that this is such a cool thing, such a cool little piece of history, and I'm glad that I have it, even though I don't have the game that goes inside of it. I just think it's good to preserve this kind of stuff. Now, the obvious question, the obvious follow-up to that, are those games from before, let's say the NES, because I think the NES really revolutionized everything, and the NES made video games. Again, I'm going to be really careful, because I don't want to alienate anybody who loves the Atari 2600, for instance. But the NES brought a whole new scope to gaming that we had never seen before. I mean, it was really an evolution of the medium completely. And while I do love Atari 2600 games, you can see I've got some, well, you can't really see it, but I've got some over here. They're in a little stack. And I do love Atari 2600 games, and regularly I'll pop these out and I'll play them for a couple of hours, and then I'll put them back and I won't play them for a while. But the NES, you know, when the NES came out, those were games that you could sit down and you could play for hours, and you weren't just doing the same thing over and over and over again. You know, there was variety, there were compelling reasons to continue playing beyond just trying to beat your high scores. And while I love the older systems, I think that that's the one valid argument about collecting and playing those older systems, is that the NES really changed the game. And if you want to collect systems before that, you need to know, or you need to understand, or you need to have an ancillary reason, like let's preserve video gaming history, in order to really make it worthwhile. That said, Atari 2600 games are very cheap to collect. And if you're trying to collect something and you're an older guy, maybe you had an Atari 2600 when you were a kid, or maybe your uncle had one when you were a kid and you grew up in the 90s and you played it all the time. If you have nostalgia for it and you want to get into game collecting, those games are so cheap to collect. And if you're going to do it, just go ahead and do it now, because they're cheap, and eventually they won't be cheap. Someday, I have a feeling they won't be cheap. In short, I think that there's a place for everything. I think there's a place for every period in gaming throughout the years. You know, I think that the history there and the story of watching gaming evolve from bits on a screen to these colorful, imaginative sprites. I think there's so much history there that it's worth preserving that stuff, and it's worth appreciating that stuff if you can now. If you have an opportunity, I would suggest that anybody you can go visit the Video Game Museum. It's the National Video Game Museum in Frisco, Texas, really close to where I live. And I love this place. They have everything that has to do with gaming from the early days up to now. They've got a huge collection. They've got a ton of history and articles and pictures and videos and systems you can play. You can play a Commodore 64. You can play a Macintosh. You can play a Vectrex. Vectrex, who's ever heard of a Vectrex? That's one of my favorite systems ever. I don't even have one, but I played a Vectrex at the Video Game Museum one time, and I know that someday I'm gonna have to get a Vectrex. I'm gonna have to work as hard as I can, and I'm gonna have to find one for a reasonable cost, and I'm gonna have to get a Vectrex because I played it one time at the National Video Game Museum, and it was that cool because it's a piece of history. And that's the end of the rant, I guess. Yes. So one of my mods, Creeper, asked, when are you going to play or stream Twilight Princess HD again? Years ago, I played Zelda Twilight Princess HD, and I did like 5 streams of it maybe, and then I stopped playing for some reason. And I haven't gone back to play it since, and Creeper asks me this question about 5 times a week, I think. So the answer is probably not anytime soon. But I want to assure you, we're very happy together, and we see each other all the time. We talk all the time. I pass meaningful glances at Twilight Princess HD, and just because you don't see us on camera together doesn't mean that we're fighting. We're fine. We're fine. And someday, yes, maybe I'll stream it again. I don't know. Probably not today. Probably not tomorrow. Or the next day. Or the day after that. Or the day... Well, maybe the day after that. What day would that be? All right, guys. Well, I hope you enjoyed this. If you want to see some of your questions get answered, make sure to join the Discord server, especially if you're a sponsor of the channel or a member on YouTube. You get your questions answered every single time, guaranteed. So I hope that you guys will join the Discord and send me some cool questions for me to answer in the next video. Thank you so much for watching, and see you later.